Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today is Tuesday. We're going to be doing our power rankings, or our updated tier list for the best decks in Pokemon Pocket right now for this EV Grove Rank 3 season. We're going into like the third week, and to be honest with you, we talked a lot on Monday about how the format is kind of coming full circle, so I wanted to kind of wrap up this series for this format. This is going to be the third kind of tier list or power rankings that we're doing here on the channel, and we're going to do the same thing that we did last week, where we're actually just going to update the previous week's tier list and then talk a little bit about the decks and maybe how their positioning in the metagame has changed. We do have one new inclusion on the tier list this week, which is going to be Solgaleo and Sylveon, as opposed to, of course, Solgaleo and Shiinotic. So we'll cover that in a little bit for sure, and we'll place it accurately on the tier list. This one definitely should go even quicker than last week is, I guess, my assumption. Honestly, yeah, I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comment section below, but this is going to be the last, I think, tier list, the last rankings, because I do think that as we go into this third week, and of course carrying over into the fourth week, I do believe that every deck in the metagame has really kind of found its positioning, and I think that the placements for every strategy and deck and archetype are going to probably stay mostly the same. And that's kind of what I mean by things kind of coming around full circle. Everything's kind of settled down and balanced out. And then next week, I think we should be getting an announcement for A4, which is going to be massively exciting. And of course, we'll talk about that a ton whenever that announcement comes out. But before we get into that, guys, we actually have a sponsor for today's video. Alright guys, so the sponsor of today's video is none other than FlexiSpot, who were kind enough to send me one of their new Lotus recliner chairs to review. After quickly putting it together and then testing it out, I can honestly say that this is the nicest chair that I have ever owned. The chair is very, very spacious, with a 21-inch seat width and a 10-inch armrest width. Anybody of any size will be able to enjoy this chair as much as they possibly want to. And what you don't normally see with chairs like this is the combination of being able to extend that footrest and recline fully back, alongside of the 360-degree swivel mechanism, allowing you to enjoy this chair in basically every way possible. Not only that, but it's also a rocking chair. Absolutely crazy. This Lotus recliner chair can come with a variety of additional features and customizations. You should go check it out. Down in the description below, there's going to be a link that you should click, and don't forget to use the exclusive code LOTUS30 at checkout for $30 off your order, as well as free shipping. That is LOTUS30, code at checkout. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video and hooking it up with the chair. I really do appreciate it. Now let's get back to the video. All right, let's get right back to it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the sponsor there. I don't normally do a lot of sponsors on the channel, but FlexiSpot, they were kind enough to sponsor today's video, which is super cool of them. But anyway, let's get into the tier list. So the first thing that I'm gonna actually do here, now that we're kind of getting right into it, is I'm actually gonna remove the D tier, and I'm just gonna say we're gonna rename this to Not Played, because to be fair, I think the D tier, as the format goes on, just becomes a little bit of an unfair, I guess, criticism of some of these decks, because it's really hard to rank things that really just don't see that much play. So we're going to keep the S tier, the A tier, the B tier, and the C tier, and then really everything that's fallen out of favor in terms of, how many people are playing these decks in competitions, that's just going to move down to the Not Played tier. That way we're not, ranking them in a sense that they're bad decks, because they might be pretty good deck lists, they just aren't seeing enough play. So that's why they're going to be, instead of the D tier, now they're going to be in the Not Played tier, which is totally fine, I think, and a little bit more fair, I think, to some of those decks. So we're going to start from the top down, as we normally do, and at the end, we have our one new deck list here, Solgaleo and Sylveon. We still have the deck lists that have fallen off the tier list last week, that being, of course, Charizard, Sylvally, Sylvally Zero Aura, which was merged into one archetype, being Sylvally Oricorio, or Electric type Sylvally. We have Decidueye and Dragonite. These are cards, or decks rather, that fell out of the metagame completely, and there's going to be some inclusions to that as well, but we're actually going to upgrade them and put them on the tier list, just in this sort of don't or not played tier. Again, some of these decks might be fine, they might be well positioned, it's just hard to know because nobody's really playing them right now. So anyway, they're going to go right there into the Not Played tier, and now we're going to start from the top down. So the first deck to take a look at is going to be, of course, Sylveon and Greninja. This is a big reason why we're not spending too much time talking about these decks, because we've talked about them ad nauseum over the last few weeks. So Sylveon, Greninja, still the best deck in the game. It did not win this past weekend, which I was actually kind of surprised about. Giratina and Darkrai did end up winning, but still the most successful deck when you look at the results of that tournament in its entirety, right? So even though the first place player wasn't playing Sylveon and Greninja and Giratina, the deck list overall still saw a massive amount of play, had the highest A2 conversion rate, and had the highest average win rate amongst all of the decks that were, high up on the meta share sort of percentage-wise. So it's got to stay in the S tier. I think that this is the #1 deck of the format. Even when the Oricorio counter meta flooded into the second week, this deck list really didn't struggle that much. It does fairly well against Oricorio. There's some bad matchups for the deck, but there's never any terrible matchups for Sylveon and Greninja, so it's going to definitely remain in the S tier, and I think that this is the top deck of the format, and it's going to be really difficult to knock this off its pedestal realistically because it is such a consistent deck list, but also just a really well-balanced deck in terms of its approach, and a bit of a high roll deck. It's everything kind of built into one. It's still seeing a ton of play. Maybe people will kind of forget about it when we go into the next expansion, but it'll be really tough to see a new deck list that is going to be, really strong up against Sylveon and Greninja. We'll have to see exactly how that goes, but definitely deserves S tier for the third week in a row, which is interesting and very, very impressive. Next up is going to be Sylvally Oricorio. Again, the last tier list, the second tier list we did, this was when the counter meta, the Oricorio meta, was emerging, and I think that a lot of the top decks that we're seeing a ton of play in the format were actually weak to Oricorio, and that's why last week it was a big emphasis, right? In our meta report, we talked about it. In our tier list, we ranked it in the S tier, and then, of course, we just spoke a lot of different ways about all of these Oricorio decks because they really were well positioned. Going into this third week, they have been, leveled again. So they're no longer, heavily countering the entire meta. They're really just sort of an important inclusion in the metagame, and they're all really strong decks. Sylvally Oricorio being the #1 most played Oricorio deck, but it isn't nearly as well positioned as it was. It did fairly well at the Ursa Days tournament, but it didn't do phenomenally well. Its win rate was definitely way down. A couple of players, ranked pretty highly. It was almost 9% of the meta share, which was honestly quite surprising. It was the third most played deck. We're going to move this deck from S tier. Again, Sylvally Oricorio still really strong, but definitely not S tier again, as things have kind of come around full circle. We're going to move it down to the A tier, and I believe that in this video, in this final power rankings, we're going to see a lot of decks into the A tier because I really do feel like there's one standout being Sylvally Greninja, but there's a lot of really strong deck lists. Next up is going to be Leafeon and Flareon. I believe that Leafeon Flareon is still a really strong deck list. It kind of underperformed last week, but again, I just feel like it wasn't necessarily super strong against some of the other decks that rose back up in play. I still think it's a quality deck list. I don't believe it's bad enough for me to put it in like the B tier, but in my mind, this really is sort of outside that top 3, top 4 deck in the format range, but still a quality deck list. We're pretty generous as to which decks we're putting in the A tier, and I believe that this definitely deserves to be A tier still, so we're going to keep it here. We'll order the tiers after we go through them, but for now, Leafeon Flareon is going to be staying here into the A tier. Next up is Giratina and Darkrai. So Giratina Darkrai did win the Ursa Days Pocket Tournament this past weekend. Still one of the best decks in the game. It has definitely cemented itself, if it hadn't previously, as the greatest deck in Pokemon Pocket of all time. It's consistent. It doesn't have really much of a downside. It does the same thing every game. You can play a ton of trainer cards. It's got Disruption, it's got Gust, it's got Healing, it's got damage modifiers, it's got it all. Very, very consistent strategy. I think Giratina Darkrai will be around for a very long time. I think that perhaps the Oricorio decks, which you're seeing play both Sylvally Oricorio, Tapu Koko, even Luxray or things like Magnezone or Greninja Oricorio, these are deck lists that can build their deck in a way that definitely counters Giratina and Darkrai. They just didn't do that this past week. They kind of assumed that Oricorio would be enough, but it really didn't end up being enough, and I think that's a big reason why Giratina Darkrai ended up winning. Now, it didn't have a phenomenal win rate. It was pretty close to 50%. It did get first place, but when we take a look at all of these decks holistically throughout this entire format, I really don't think Giratina Darkrai is on the level of Sylveon and Greninja. I think realistically, there's actually a pretty big difference between those two decks in terms of which ones are the best. This was the 4th most played deck of this past weekend, and like I said, it did get first place, but I don't feel confident enough to call this in the same tier as Sylveon and Greninja. It doesn't have the same high win rates. It doesn't have as nearly enough play or enough results realistically over the last few weeks. So Giratina Darkrai, still a very, very strong deck list. This is one of these decks that I'm going to reserve for like a high A tier spot. Some people might be a little bit disappointed about that. The Giratina Darkrai stands, who of course love this deck list, I think it's phenomenal, right? But one thing I will say is that the higher decks, like the decks at the top of A tier, really aren't going to be that different from S tier. Like there's certainly a gap there, which is why we're segmenting them. But all of the decks in A tier, and especially the ones that are going to be at the top of A tier, are still some of the best decks in the entire game, right? So we're going to probably reserve Sylveon and Greninja for S tier, and I don't know if anything's really going to compete for that S tier slot. But anyway, Giratina Darkrai is going to probably go at the top of A tier, but not moving up into S tier this week. That's my opinion. And next up, we've got Buzzwole, and Buzzwole actually is very interesting. It actually struggled quite heavily this past weekend. I still think Buzzwole is a very quality deck list. Even though it maybe, you know, struggles with how much fire is in the format, there's still a lot of Leafeon Flareon, and Charizard has emerged as the #2 most played deck of the format. So Buzzwole probably isn't in a great spot, but I still think that Buzzwole does really well against Giratina Darkrai. It can do well against Sylveon Greninja. It can do well against Sylvally, and of course it does fairly well against Guzzlord and some other decks like Oricorio in the format as well. So I really like Buzzwole. I think it's still one of the better decks. If Fire wasn't super popular, I think Buzzwole would end up being one of the top decks of the game, but luckily, you know, it's definitely counterplayed a little bit by all of the Fire deck lists. I still think Buzzwole's an A tier deck. I don't feel strongly enough to move it out of B tier or out of A tier and into B tier, so it's going to stay there. Probably a middle to low A tier pick, but again, we'll order the list here towards the end. And next up, we've got Tapu Koko and Oricorio. Now, Tapu Koko Oricorio is, again, still one of the more underrated decks in my opinion. Very interesting to look at the results over the past week because people that were playing 2 Tapu Koko and 1 Arceus actually had a massive struggle in the Ursa Days tournament this weekend. However, people that were playing 1 Arceus and 1 Tapu Koko did really strongly. So I think it's interesting. I think that this is still a very quality deck list. I think that it's kind of the awkward cousin to Sylvally Oricorio. For a brief moment there, I really did feel like Arceus Tapu Koko was actually the better option, and I did recommend it pretty heavily last week once we were kind of in the midst of that counter meta metagame. But as things have come around full circle, it really just kind of ends up being a very decent deck list. It's something that again, very similar to Buzzwole, I think that is probably going to struggle in some ways in its current positioning. So it's not going to end up being like one of the top decks of the game, but it's definitely better than B tier. That's how I still feel about this deck list. So again, it's also going to stay in the A tier. Will also probably end up being a lower to mid A tier. We'll rank it there at the end or order these at the end. But anyway, Tapu Koko Oricorio, it's going to sit right there, still in the A tier. It's not going anywhere. Both of the Oricorio decks, whether it's Sylvally and Tapu Koko, are both strong aggro archetypes that just gel really well with Oricorio, which I think are still very important cards in the metagame for sure. Next up is Flareon Turtonator. So the deck list that got second at the first Ursa Days tournament of this weekend has basically been completely overturned by Leafeon and Flareon. So Flareon was actually really strong early on in the format, and I think it still is. This is the version of Flareon that actually deals with Oricorio. I hit my microphone there. It's the version of Flareon that deals with Oricorio much more better than the Leafeon version does, and I think that's the main upside to this Flareon, but unfortunately it just isn't seeing nearly as much play. I think if people are playing a bit more of a high roll fire deck, they're going to play Charizard. It's got a little bit higher upside. I still think Flareon is good, but like I said, not enough people are playing it. It didn't do phenomenally well at the last tournament this past weekend, so we're actually going to move Flareon Turtonator down to the B tier. And I think that this is a fine place for Flareon and Turtonator to be. I think it's a very respectable deck. We'll probably keep it there in sort of the mid to high B tier range, even though not many people are playing it. Enough people are still playing it, and I still feel like there's some merit to this deck list. So I'm not going to completely get rid of it. I think it's still real. It's still a real thing. We're going to put it into the B tier, but it is being demoted here in the final tier list just because we can't keep a deck that barely saw any play going into the last few weeks into the A tier. So for that reason, B tier is where it's going to go here. Next up is Guzzlord, which has remained still one of the most played decks of the format. And I like Guzzlord, I really do. But at the same vein, I think that it really only does well against a few specific archetypes. The interesting thing about Buzzwole, I guess, I say interesting, but the thing that I don't necessarily understand with Buzzwole is that people will continue to play it and it continues to like surprise us, but it never like really pops off. It's always been like one of these really in-between deck lists. Last week, we were pretty generous because in the counter meta, Guzzlord was actually a pretty good decision because it was strong against the Oricorio decks. But Oricorio isn't necessarily the main counterpoint of the format right now. Buzzwole's still going to struggle, right, against Sylveon and Greninja. It's going to struggle against, Buzzwole. It's going to struggle against Buzzwole, but it's also going to struggle against, like, Flareon and Leafeon as well. Any of these grass-type decks, you know what I mean? So honestly, I kind of feel interestingly about Guzzlord. And one thing that I have to just commit to it. It feels bad because some people definitely love Guzzlord, but this is like the 8th most played deck of the formats right now, at least, I believe, or maybe even the 9th. We're actually going to move Guzzlord. I'm going to put Guzzlord down here into the B tier. It's going to be like a high B tier deck. We're thinning out the A tier a little bit. We got to be a little bit more selective. But I do think Guzzlord is still fine. In fact, I actually kind of... It's got to be at the top of B tier, but I do think that there's definitely some segmentation there, and I can't really justify putting it in the A tier based off of its performances over the last week or so. Last week it was A tier, and I think it was a really strong choice. But this week, as the format has really settled down, we're going to put Guzzlord into the B tier, and that's where it's going to sit. Maybe it pops back up next format, but for now, the Dark Ultra Beast package, I think, is still very strong. We're going to go ahead and put it right there into the B tier. Now, the other Dark deck that we don't actually have on the tier list, where there's a couple of them technically, is going to be like the Naganadel aggro deck with Darkrai, which I think is still quality. I actually mentioned it in my best decks for ranked video this past weekend because it was such a hard counterplay to Oricorio. People just aren't really playing it in a competitive setting. I think it was more of like a specific counterplay to that ranked metagame for that weekend. So it's not on the tier list, but that is a deck list. It would probably fall its way into like a B or C tier, to be honest with you. And then the other deck list that we don't have on the tier list is like the Arceus Crobat decks, which again, still don't really ever see play, if we're being honest with you. But, you know, we could necessarily put them on the tier list and put them into not played. They play Snorlax, they play Ilima. It's a fun deck list, but it's not on the tier list. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. Those are the other dark decks that I guess are technically decks, but they're not on the tier list. But anyway, Guzzlord going right there into the B tier, and I think that's a fine place for it. Next up is Magnezone and Sylveon, and again, a deck list that has been well positioned and has performed well week after week after week, but for whatever the reason, people just don't really feel that interested in playing it. If they're playing Electric type, they probably want to play Oricorio decks, and if they're playing Sylveon decks, they probably want to play Sylveon Greninja or Sylveon and Charizard, right? Or as the new deck list that we're going to be ranking later, Sylveon and Solgaleo. So I think this is just one of those decks where it never really caught on, but it was always fairly well positioned. I think at this point, people are just a little bit bored of playing Magnezone, but guess what? It's still a quality deck, and it's staying into the A tier this week. It has to, because Magnezone and Sylveon is still well positioned. It's good against Sylvally. It's going to be strong against other Oricorio deck lists, and it's actually pretty decent against Greninja and Sylveon. So I really like Magnezone. I have said it, I think, week after week. I just really feel strongly that this deck list is a good choice. And even though maybe people don't really want to play it, or not many people have played it, it's still well positioned. It's still doing well for the few people that are playing it. So we're going to keep it right there onto the A tier. The last two decks in A tier that we're going to talk about here are Sylvally Rampardos and Charizard, which, spoiler, will both be staying into the A tier. So Sylvally Rampardos is honestly, what are we even going to say about this deck list? It's just a very, very strong going second deck, and it has massive struggles going first. There's some inconsistencies with Rampardos, but to be fair, this deck list has really good synergy. It's like the original Sylvally deck list, and I think it's still the best way to play fighting in the format right now. Garchomp is still a decent deck list, but yeah, Sylvally Rampardos, man, it's still good. I think it's still sort of farming a lot of those Oricorio matchups, which are, of course, still common in the format. Even though Oricorio hasn't completely taken over yet, or I guess anymore, it's still a strong deck. You know, I mean, we can't move Sylvally Rampardos out of the A tier. You know, it's probably going to be like a middle to low A tier pick. But it did fairly well at the past Ursa Days tournament. I think it was like the 10th most played deck. We're going to keep it here into the A tier, and then, of course, we'll order it later. But yeah, Sylvally Rampardos still a strong deck. Just make sure you go second and you'll be okay. Okay, next up is Charizard and Sylveon. We talked about this a little bit in Meta Monday. The thing with Charizard is that I actually do believe Charizard and Sylveon is the strongest deck in the game right now. It's got the highest upside. This deck list is absolutely insane. Yes, it's a bit of an RNG deck, but Sylveon really bypasses a lot of those RNG issues. One thing that, again, we went into in heavy detail in Meta Monday was that a lot of people are not playing Guzma in their Charizard deck, and I don't understand it. I've been saying it week after week. I know some people just don't really believe in it. Some people like to play Mars. I think Sabrina is definitely a requirement with Flareon to get around to Oricorio, but Guzma is like the other primary win condition card for Charizard. There's just too many giant capes running around, too many tool carts that can really force Charizard to not win the game. You know what I mean? Your turns are definitely limited with Charizard, and it's about stoking early, getting Charizard out, and then just taking 1-hit KOs. We can 1-hit KO Solgaleo if we have Guzma. We can 1-hit KO Giratina and Darkrai, or Leafeon, or Flareon if we have Guzma, and we can 1-hit KO Sylveon as well, which is really, really important. So I think you have to run Guzma and Charizard. I really think so. And if you do, Charizard has potential. It has like S tier potential. If this was a purely ranked mode tier list, I would put Charizard in the S tier, but in tournaments, for whatever the reason, just people aren't necessarily playing, at least most often, the most optimal list, in my opinion. That still means that Charizard is a really, really quality deck. It's actually solidified itself as the second most popular deck in the format right now. This is a bit of a throwback, because I just remember, like, in that first week, like, finding the Charizard Sylveon deck and just realizing that it was absolutely insane. Carried me, like, all the way through ranked mode. It got me to like 2,000 points in like 3 days, and then I just sort of haven't played much because I've been busy. But anyway, Charizard Sylveon, definitely still an A tier deck list. And I think that, again, if this was if everyone was playing Guzma, I think the data would be very different for Charizard, and I think the results would be very different in a tournament setting, and it would probably find its way up into the S tier. But again, we have to justify it based off of the decks that people are playing and its results right in the tournaments as well. I will say the #1 ranked player in the entire game of Pokemon Pocket right now in the ranked mode in this ranked season is playing Charizard, and they're playing Guzma, and they're absolutely farming the entire game. So keep that in mind. But anyway, Charizard Sylveon is going to sit right here into the A tier, which I think is pretty good for it, honestly. I think it's like a high A tier deck. Okay. Now let's take a look at the B tier. We already talked about Guzzlord and Flareon. Let's move these down to the bottom, I suppose. And let's talk about Greninja and Oricorio. This is a deck that, again, has been floating around week after week. Never really saw that much play, but for good reason, because its win rates were always below 50%. There was never really a large tournament where this deck list ended up doing very well. I think that it's Oricorio, which gives it some strengths, but it basically loses to all of the other Oricorio decks, which are just much more consistent and fast-paced. And for that reason, you can't play Oricorio, which is a counter deck, and then lose to all of the other versions of Oricorio, especially when they're more common and more well played or just see more play. So it has to stay in the B tier. Honestly, if we take a look at the win rates alone, like there's a case to even move this down to C tier, but I don't think it's a C tier deck. I think it's a B tier deck, and I think that's totally fine. Now, Garchomp is an interesting one. I'm actually going to be promoting Garchomp in this sort of end of the tier list because, you know, if we're talking about the metagame in general right now, like Sylvally Rampardos and Garchomp are the only two fighting decks in the format, and they're the only really true counterplays to Oricorio, which is interesting, right? And I think that Garchomp is just sort of the high roll, high potential version of Sylvally Rampardos, right? So if you want to play a more consistent, I guess like less high upside version of Sylvally Rampardos or just Rampardos, then you would play Sylvally. But if you wanted to play a bit more of a high roll version, like Solgaleo, like Charizard, things like that, but fighting type, then Garchomp is the deck for you. And I think it's still a really quality deck. It was, I believe, what is this, the 8th or 9th most played deck in the Today's tournament, had a winning win rate, had a couple of day 2 appearances. So I actually really like Garchomp. And I think that once the format really settles here, which it is, Garchomp's going to really emerge as a totally fine deck. I mean, one of the standard A tier decks of the format. Will it be like high A tier? Probably not, but I will be moving Garchomp up to A tier, and I feel pretty comfortably about that. What do we got next? We've got Sylveon and Espeon. So this is like the psychic type Sylveon package. Basically, Sylveon, Giratina, but without Greninja and just playing like some other psychic type attackers, whether that's the small Sylveon or Espeon or Tapu, whatever it is. This deck list is good. Honestly, I think that it's just not seeing much play. And to be honest with you, like the Greninja version is just better. So to be honest, like maybe that kind of drops it down a peg is kind of what I'm thinking. Like it's interesting because like how are we going to rank a deck list when there's literally basically almost identically the same deck, but it's the best deck in the game, and people are just choosing to like change it a bit and make it objectively worse? That's the only thing that stops me from like, you know, keeping this deck list like somewhat high up on the tier list. So when we look at it in that perspective, like I don't want to give people the wrong opinions. Like if you have Greninja, if you have all of these cards to play the Sylveon Giratina deck, and you also have Greninja, like just play Greninja. It makes the deck way better. And I think for that reason, I'm actually going to move it down to the C tier, just because it's not something I would really recommend. You know, like the B tier decks are definitely like worse decks, but I would still like recommend them to people. If they, you know, if they had the cards and they wanted to play something, I'd be like, this is fine. You can play the C tier or the B tier decks and probably win games. Like I would really recommend you don't play this just because there's a better version directly to it. So that's why we're actually going to put it there into the C tier, which again, you know, it is what it is, but most people aren't really playing this list anyway. Which is funny because at the beginning of the format, like this is what I made my video on. I was like, this is the new strongest deck. Like Giratina Sylveon is crazy, and it was really good. And then people were like, yeah, but like, and what if we play it with Greninja? And then that just ended up being the best deck in the entire game, which is funny. Like I feel a little bit silly about that, but at the time, you know, like it was like day one, you know what I mean? So I understood the Giratina Sylveon, you know, combination there being insane, but Greninja really did pop off that deck list. So we're gonna go ahead, put it there into the C tier. I think that's a comfortable place for it. Next up, we have Luxray. Oh man, Luxray. I thought Luxray was really cool because again, it was a really nice counterplay option when we were going into that second week and the counter meta was so prevalent. Now there's a lot more sort of balance in the format, and Luxray definitely struggles again against the other most popular Oricorio decks, which, to be fair, are just a lot more fast-paced and aggressive and kind of outpace Luxray and really make that matchup tough for Luxray. So for that reason, it's tough to recommend it. And at this point, when all of these other decks are still seeing a ton of play, Sylvally is still one of the more common cards in the entire game. I just can't really justify playing Oricorio and Luxray. So we're actually going to move it down to the C tier as well. That shifted the whole tier list, which is crazy. We're going to move Luxray down into the C tier. Unfortunately, still a fine deck list, still a decent deck, but just not something that I would really recommend to most people. Given that the other Oricorio decks were just so good and fast-paced and aggressive right now. Next up is Solgaleo and Shiinotic. So again, we also have to be a little bit prevalent of the other Solgaleo deck, which is, spoiler, really good. And because this is objectively like the worst, or I guess the lesser version of Solgaleo, we can't rank it high on the tier list, right? Because why would I even like slightly recommend a deck when there's just basically the exact same thing but better? I know some people might be like, oh, I don't have Sylveon, so could I play Shiinotic? Like, you totally could. You could take this and complete Solgaleo and Sylveon deck and swap it for Shiinotic, and it would be fine. It wouldn't be as good, I don't think, but it would be a totally fine deck. So I think B tier is probably okay, but I will say that the Sylveon deck list and the way that people are playing that Sylveon deck with Solgaleo, which is basically a copy-paste of the Charizard list, is just a better format for Solgaleo. We'll keep it in the B tier. We'll keep it B tier for now, but I really don't feel that strongly about it, and I would kind of recommend that you probably just play Sylveon with Giratina, but I think it's fine. Solgaleo is still okay, I guess is really where that comes out. Next up, we've got Magnezone and Shiinotic, another deck that really kind of fell completely out of the metagame, mostly because everybody swapped to Sylveon and Magnezone, which is an A-tier deck. So for that reason, we're actually going to move this down to not played, which, you know, feels bad because this was like the Magnezone deck of the previous format. But again, I think that Sylveon has basically replaced all iterations of Shiinotic in the format, which is interesting because Shiinotic was decent, but for whatever the reason, I just feel like, you know, Magnezone and Shiinotic just, you know, it's just not a deck anymore. Like, people aren't playing it, right? If you're playing Magnezone, they're playing it with Sylveon because I just think Sylveon's a better option. Even though the deck list does function a lot differently, like Magnezone and Shiinotic was playing like Shaman sometimes and Oricorio. Magnezone and Sylveon plays dual energies, you know what I mean? So they're playing like, that's one, we haven't talked about the energies in this video, but we've talked about these decks so many times, guys. Come on, just go watch one of the previous more videos where I've included or talked about which energies the decks are playing. In this video, it's not included. I just, you know, it's too much to talk about there. But anyway, yeah, Magnezone Shiinotic completely fallen out of the format in favor of Sylveon, as I think really any Shiinotic deck has become at this point. But anyway, yeah, okay. Solgaleo Shiinotic still sees play, which is why we're not moving it into the not played. Like 10 people played it this weekend, so yeah. Anyway, Incineroar. Okay, speaking of decks that nobody really plays anymore, we have Incineroar, but technically speaking, a few people did play it this weekend. It is a deck list, and I actually don't think it's that bad. It's just basically a worse version of Charizard and Sylveon, but theoretically the deck does function actually a bit differently. Really strong if you kind of lead with Litten in the active spot and you're going second or first even and you get the rare candy combo. The main reason it's not as good as Charizard is because if you lead with EEVEE in the active spot, like you're just behind a turn, and oftentimes that's going to result in you just not winning the game unless somehow you can just, like, if you're going second and you can still turn 2 rare candy into Incineroar, but even then you're 3 turns away and you can't actually attack with a full damage on Incineroar until turn 4. So that's the main downside to this deck. I think it's fine though. I think it's still a B tier deck. Some people are still playing it, and I think it's totally fine. So we're going to leave these cards or these decks here into the B tier, and I think those are all proper. Yeah, I think this is probably fine. I think this is a good place for these B tier decks. Yeah, so we got Incineroar, Solgaleo, and Shiinotic, Greninja Oricorio, Guzzlord, and Flareon. That's the B tier. Again, not in order yet. We'll order everything at the end. And I think those are proper B tier decks. C tier, we've talked about Luxray, we talked about Sylveon. Next up is the Sweets deck, which again is still seeing play. But honestly, if we did have a D tier, this is where this deck would go. This is by far, I think, the worst deck on the tier list. There's just no reason to play it. The Sweets archetype kind of functions similarly to, I guess, Sylvally decks, but Sylvally decks are just objectively better in almost every way. And there's just too many large HP Pokemon that are still fast enough. Like Charizard is attacking you on turn 3, Solgaleo is attacking you on turn 2 sometimes. Like, we just can't justify playing Sweets. It also loses to Garchomp, it loses to Sylvally, it probably loses to Greninja as well with all of the bench sniping. So, I mean, like, Sweets is like a deck list, but it saw play early on the format, but has basically completely stopped seeing play. I think like 2 people played it this past weekend and they didn't win a single game. So I mean, we're gonna move. I'm just gonna get it out here. We're gonna put it into not played. Sweets is just not a real deck. Like it saw play at some point, but at this point, at the end of this metagame, it just can't really even be considered like a deck in the format, which again, I guess feels kind of bad, but we have to be somewhat realistic with how we talk about the deck lists. Next up is Primarina, and I don't want to put Primarina. What are we going to do with Primarina? Let's see here. So 3 people played it this past weekend, and they went 10-7, which is technically a winning record. So barely anybody played it. So I'm honestly, but I think it's actually better than, I don't know. I mean, we're not gonna, let's keep it in the C tier. I think that Primarina is fine. Something that never really caught on. There's just too much Oricorio, too much like fast-paced Electro type decks to justify playing Primarina. But I think it's still a deck list, and I think it has some merit. Like, it's not a terrible deck. Like, it's really not. And I think C tier is probably fine. The C tier is kind of reserved here, as we see these only 3 decks. These are like 3 decks that still see a bit of play, but really never see that much success, and probably shouldn't see that much play because they're just really not that good. So C tier is fine. We're gonna keep the C tier how it is, and I think we'll just keep Primarina EX right there. It's mostly played with Sylveon right now, just like the other Stage 2 decks are. Again, just not like objectively kind of a worse decision as opposed to the other Stage 2 Pokemon that play, Sylveon. Same with Incineroar. People are just playing it with Sylveon at this point. Okay. Lastly, we've gotten the new deck on the tier list, which is going to be Solgaleo and Sylveon. And I think we talked about it the last couple of days. I definitely talked about it on Friday when it popped up. I thought it was a really smart choice to counter Oricorio. And it's been doing really well, and it did well in the tournament. 10 people played it, which again, it didn't wasn't necessarily super common. Like more people or the same amount of people were actually still playing Solgaleo and Shiinotic. But it did get 2nd place at the Ursa Days tournament with only 9 people playing the deck list. And it did have a 54% win rate this weekend. It's a really good deck list. I really think it's strong. I think it's by far the best way to play Solgaleo right now. And I think it's actually kind of on par to how Solgaleo and Shiinotic was last format. In this format, though, I think it's actually just pretty decent. We're gonna put it we'll probably put it A tier, honestly. I think it's very similar to Charizard Sylveon, Garchomp Sylveon, Magnezone Sylveon. These are just like really decent, powerful, well-positioned Stage 2 Pokemon that just are enabled by Sylveon. Solgaleo, if Charizard didn't exist, this Solgaleo deck might end up being probably one of the better decks of the format, but unfortunately Charizard is Charizard, and Charizard likes the Solgaleo matchup, especially when we play Guzma in Charizard. So I do think that this is an A tier deck, definitely, but I don't know. We'll order them right now. But yeah, I think that coming onto the scene right now has kind of replaced this Solgaleo, and I think it's better. So this Solgaleo is going to just stay in the B tier, but this version with Sylveon is going to actually end up being like an A tier choice for sure, and that's kind of how I feel. So these are all of the decks in the format right now. I guess all of these decks down here are not really seeing play anymore, but anyway, from C tier and above, these are all of the meta decks that are kind of seeing a decent amount of play, that are like really in the meta right now. And I think that there's actually quite a few of them, so this is pretty cool. But what we're going to do now is rank the decks. So yeah, Sylveon is going to be Sylveon and Greninja are going to be the only S tier deck. I think it really is just far and above. It's seeing twice as much play as the next most played deck, and it has a positive win rate week after week, which is just very impressive. It's won the last 2 weeks. It got top 4 this past weekend. It's just incredibly good. Massive. It had like a 40% day 2 meta share, which is absolutely ridiculous. So S tier, the only S tier deck right now, and I do kind of believe that to be true. Next up, okay, so let's rank the A tier here. And which decks do we think are the best decks in A tier? I think Giratina Darkrai probably takes the #1 spot in A tier. That's my opinion. I think that Charizard is right there, though. I think that Charizard is still, again, the most powerful deck of the game. It actually beats Giratina Darkrai, and I think it actually probably has a winning matchup against Sylveon if we're playing Guzma. Again, most people are just playing the incorrect deck list, so it's hard to rank it. But anyway, we'll put Charizard here at the top of A tier as well. And I'm actually going to move Solgaleo and Sylveon up here into like the top of A tier. And then let's see, what do we want to put after the 3 decks here at the top of A tier? I'll probably slide in... this is an interesting decision. We'll probably slot in the Oricorio decks and then Magnezone. And then I'm going to put, actually, we're going to put Rampardos. I'm going to put Rampardos above the Oricorio decks because, again, I think because the Oricorio decks are so common, Rampardos is actually really well positioned. I would rather play all of these decks here above it, but I think that this is still like a middle to high A tier deck actually right now. The Oricorio decks plus Magnezone will go below that. And then we've got Leafeon, Flareon, Buzzwole, and then Garchomp, which I think is probably fine. In fact, I'll actually just put Garchomp right next to Sylvally Rampardos because it is so similar. But it's not better, I don't think. It could be, actually. Yeah, I'm actually gonna do it because it's nice. I feel nice, like kind of maybe it's just my OCD and like putting them all together. Like we've gotten Sylveon and Greninja, right, which is the top deck in the game. Then we've got Giratina Darkrai, which I think is just sort of like the GOAT of Pokemon Pocket, which isn't nearly as good as it was maybe previously, but still a top deck and still always vying for that top spot. And then we've got the 3 Stage 2 Pokemon that love to be paired with Sylveon that are all just really inherently strong. So we're gonna put them all next to each other there at the top of A tier. And then we've got the 2 Sylvally decks, which are Rampardos and Oricorio. And then we've got the 2 other Electro-type decks in Tapu, Koko, and Magnezone. And then we've got the Grass decks here at the bottom of A tier. And I think that's probably fine. I like this this order here of the A tier. Next up, let's order up the B tier decks because this is an interesting one. I actually think the Fire B tier decks are actually really strong. So I'm going to put Flareon, Turtonator here, and Incineroar at the top of B tier. And I'm going to put Guzzlord right there in the middle of B tier. And then I'm going to put Solgaleo just like there. And then, yeah, Greninja Oricorio there is fine, I think. I think that's probably fine. Again, like once we're ordering B and C tier, it really doesn't matter that much, to be honest with you. And then, okay, so the C tier order, I'm actually going to leave this as is. In fact, I'll actually put Primarina above Luxray. Yeah, I'm actually going to put Primarina at the top just because it isn't, like, I think it's fine. Like, I think it's powerful enough. And there's enough fire in the format where I think Primarina is probably actually the better out of these 3 options. Again, they're all probably just C tier options, but anyway, they're going to go right there. And then, yeah, there you go. These are all the not play decks. And there is our final rankings, guys. This is our final tier list of the EV Grow format. We'll zoom out a little bit so we can see it all in one scope. And yeah, I feel pretty good about this. Basically, I like when we look back on the EV Grow format, a lot changed, right? So like when the format first began, things were very different. Everybody was really figuring out what the best new decks were, and then those decks were getting absolutely farmed by Giratina and Darkrai in that first week. And then of course Oricorio swept in, started to farm all of those deck lists as they were developing, and then going into this third week, everything sort of balanced out a little bit. And I think we're kind of seeing the true results of the format, like what this format really is, which is what I think this tier list looks like right now. I think that Sylveon is just absolutely insane. And it makes a lot of these strong stage 2 Pokemon more consistent. These high roll decks are no longer like really high roll decks. They're just massively explosive Pokemon that definitely have a lot of breaking potential, but they're way more consistent than they should be. Giratina Darkrai is still incredible. We still have the Sylvally decks, and then we've got some Oricorio and Magnezone decks that are good. And then we've got the sort of grass tempo decks, which are also good, but there's too much fire, too much Charizard for these deck lists to really be considered, high A tier picks, but they're still really quality, which is why they're going into the A tier. The B tier decks are inherently flawed, or there's just better ways to play these decks. And that's kind of what it comes down to. Incineroar is just objectively a worse version of Charizard in the format. The Flareon Turtonator, just objectively a worse version than Leafeon and Flareon, although they are a bit different. Guzzlord is just a deck that I think is a bit underwhelming when you kind of look at this entire scope of the format, but is still a decent deck list. Solgaleo Shiinotic, it's better to just play Solgaleo Sylveon. And then Greninja Oricorio, which is kind of a mash between the Oricorio decks and then Greninja Sylveon, which just means that it kind of loses to both of them, unfortunately, so it kind of falls there into the B tier. And then the C tier, which are Primarina, Luxray, and Sylveon. This is like the awkward stepchilds of the format, honestly. But they are still real decks, and that's it. That's the metagame really summarized. I have enjoyed EV Grow. I'll probably do a video probably next week where we kind of, maybe it's just going to be next Meta Monday, where we really wrap up the metagame and then we begin to look forward to the next expansion. Now, the thing is that we actually have like an additional week of this format, and I have no idea what I'm going to make videos on because next Wednesday, we'll get an announcement. It's only been it hasn't even been 3 full weeks yet of this format. But now at this point, I think that we've kind of settled in. I could be surprised because what does happen, I'm going on a tangent now. What happens at the end of these formats is that random deck lists just pop up. Like, I think that this metagame in this season will kind of carry on for about a week longer than what people are used to, and some crazy stuff is bound to happen. So it's still going to be interesting. I'm not done with this format. I'm not done with the season, but I do think that we're kind of getting a really decent full grasp understanding of what this metagame looks like. And I think that it's really interesting, and I think it's one of the more quality metagames that we've seen so far. But yeah, next week will be, or next Monday, I should say, will be sort of probably the last Meta Monday, I would assume. Maybe not even the last Meta Monday. Well, it'll be one of them for sure. I can't remember. But anyway, that's when we'll sort of wrap up the format and we'll give our kind of final opinions once we see what next week does. And then we'll kind of, figure out what to do in terms of content here on the channel. Hopefully you guys enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Shout out to the sponsor of today's video. Definitely go check them out. Link will be down in the description below. And yeah, guys, that's it. Let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah.